The next up we have with us is Arun. Yep, Dr. Arun, SP Arun. And what you know already from the flyer is that he will talk to you about visual perception and object identification. See, there was a reason I asked you to close your eyes and imagine yourself already an explorer. But none of you are doing that. But what you don't know is that he loves optical illusions. And if you want to really look up, and that's another quirk, right? I mean, optical illusions are fun. And if you want to find out more about optical illusions, do visit his lab website. It's very easy to find. Just Google SP Arun ISC and you will find him. The website is complete with scientific principles behind the illusions. The videos are hosted on his website. And you must take with you a bit of time and an explorer mentality to really, really enjoy them. He is also someone who is committed to discouraging single-use plastics. He's environmentally aware. And I would say he's driven to great heights. Welcome for us, all of us. Arun.
Okay, so thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I look forward to all the questions. Please do keep the questions alive. So I'm not a biologist. I actually tried to avoid biology as soon as I could. So at 10th, you have this choice between maths, physics, chemistry, and so I avoided biology. And but I'm a neuroscientist now in a rather quirky department because we all come from very different backgrounds. There's no undergrad program in neuroscience in the country, so you tend to come to neuroscience if you're really interested. And I hope that this question is something that you'll find interesting. So this is, I want to thank upfront our lab. We have an interesting mix of people coming from both engineering and biology backgrounds. Also, I want to thank all the funding agencies, in particular, of course, the India Alliance, for all their support throughout my independent career as a scientist. Let me start here. I hope some of you have read books like these. I read them when I was growing up in school. And I was very inspired by all these sci-fi books about robots that live in society. There's also a movie by the same name, I, Robot. Some of you might have seen it. And they talk about a future where robots are actually coexisting with us and are programmed to have certain ethical rules. And Asimov is great in this regard. He talks about all these elaborations of these rules and beautiful universe, actually. But compared to where we stand today, and this is sort of how I got into neuroscience myself, contrast to where we stand today in terms of all these kinds of technologies, right? We type into machines instead of talking to them. We can't just talk to a machine and say, okay, set up a calendar event for me, or type out this email to my mom. Can't do all these things, right? Not yet. You tidy up your room instead of a robot doing it for you. Again, that's a big challenge for robots to just go about picking up objects without dropping them or without crushing them and navigate into a room and so on and so forth. But really the challenge that I want to talk to you about and what I really sort of started getting really fascinated by and continue to be fascinated is things like this where we are still unlocking our laptops with a password instead of with our face. And that's partly because computers haven't really, or we haven't managed to make computers actually solve this problem of recognizing our face regardless of where we look, how we look, and so on. Okay, you might have seen these features in your cell phones and laptops, but they don't work robustly, and that's why you don't see them widely used today. Okay? And really the most striking example to me, and even now after studying this kind of problem for many, many years, is the fact that we still see these distorted letter recognition tasks when you browse a website and you're creating some sort of email account or doing something important on the internet. Usually your face can ask to recognize these letters. And these seem like a really, really simple task for us, but somehow they're actually there to prevent automatic computer programs from cracking this. So you can imagine that something that seems so simple for us to do, that is recognize a distorted letter, is actually a very hard task for a computer, and we don't quite know why. Okay, so I'll hope to tell you about this particular problem. Not sure what's going on. Okay, so why are computers failing so badly at a simple thing like seeing? Now, for those of you who are interested, there's a very interesting pattern that we've seen now with machines, where it's called actually Moravec's paradox, where What this guy basically said, he was one of the early thinkers in the field of artificial intelligence. What he said was very profound, that the things that we find very difficult to do, like numerical calculation, setting up long programs, repetitive tasks, and so on, are exactly what computers can do really easily. The things that we do very easily are exactly the things that computers find hard to do. Okay, so these are the simple acts of seeing, hearing, looking around, walking around. These are the things that actually are really hard for computers to do. So hopefully I can explain to you why, a little bit of understand why this is the case. Okay, so imagine how you would actually go about setting up this kind of thing in a computer. And this is by and large how computers still do vision today. What basically happens is, the task here is to find a person in the image, and these are actually slides from a colleague at Carnegie Mellon. He calls it the miserable life of a person detector. Basically what you do is, if you want to find people in the image, you do a very, very simple approach, which is that you have a template for how a person looks, or the average person looks, and you run that template at every point in the image. That's what is shown out here. These red windows are actually showing a window that is being scanned across the entire image, and wherever you get a good match, you say that's a person. Okay, that's how a computer, that's by and large still how computers are trying to find people in an image. Okay, so you look for a content on the window, you look for a good match, and if you get a good match, then you call it a person. So let's see how this kind of approach will, and you know, really what varies across computer vision algorithms is really the kind of match you look for and the kind of features you're looking for. Okay, but the basic idea is still the same. So then how does the detector do? Well, there's a couple of true detections, as they call, which is that there are actually people in the image and the computer has found it. And the reason it has found it is that the match between the template that the computer has with the template, with the content of the image is actually very good. So far so good. It finds all the right people in the image. But if you look at a little bit further, it also misses a couple of people. And if you look at the content of those windows, you will see that, yeah, and there's a couple of places where the person is not very obvious and the computer is missing it. And still, this is not looking too bad, right? Because obviously, these misses were actually blurry people, and sometimes you may not have found it, and so on. So there's still reason to be happy. The place where it really starts breaking down is if you start looking at the false alarms, which is, for example, things like this, where the computer has basically discovered a person in this lamppost. And the reason why is because there's some kind of pattern that the computer has found, which is very similar to a person. Well, now you can say, well, maybe I shouldn't look for a match like that. I should increase my threshold or requirement for a match, right? So that's very reasonable, and turns out that if you start increasing the threshold such that this is not detected, then you'll also miss a lot more people. So that is the trade-off here, which is that computers are not figuring out the right kinds of features that you need to pick out of the image to find a person. Whereas people, of course, are very good, and of course, no one in their right mind would actually find this to be a person. Okay? So when you look at the errors of a computer vision algorithm, you get weird errors which people would not normally make. Okay? So still, if you look at the performance of these computer vision algorithms, or even if you want to recognize the letter A or the distorted letter A and so on, you'll find that the performance of any given object detection task is actually almost 90 to 95%. So it's not bad. I mean, getting 90 to 95 on an exam is good, right? So the problem is that it doesn't scale up. So for example, consider what happens if you have a large number of categories you're looking for. If you want to know how many objects we recognize just routinely in the world, look for the number of common nouns. And if you look at the number of common nouns, there's at least about 10 to 30,000 common objects that we can all name. Okay, so if you look at that many different object detectors, basically what you're doing is you're looking for a chair in the image, a keyboard in the image, a car in the image, and so on. And basically, if you have a high confidence match, you'll say it's a correct detection. But look at what's happening now with this kind of image, where basically what happens is if each detector is having a 90% correct performance, okay, and you have 1,000 categories, we're not even talking about 10,000 or 30,000. With 1,000 categories, the probability of error becomes now actually 100 false alarms per image. Okay, so even though you have a pretty good performance for a particular object, scaling it up to a large number of objects actually starts breaking down. You will start having too many kinds of errors in the image. And that's really why computer vision is not really working too well today. Okay? So on the other hand, if you start looking at how the brain does it, and this is really the core focus of our lab, this is the monkey brain, and it's very similar to the human brain. It's used as a model system to study vision in humans. And the very interesting thing about the monkey brain, as well as our brain, is that a huge portion of your brain is dedicated to visual processing, okay? Consider how large it is. This is actually about 40 to 50% of your brain is involved in some kind of visual processing or the other. And if you think about the amount of space the retina occupies on your body, you can imagine how much more space is being occupied in your brain, purely because vision is so important and interesting, and it's a hard problem for the brain as well. So I want to show you a couple of interesting optical illusions which might give you an insight into how the visual system actually is doing all this complex processing. Okay, this is one which there's several that I had a choice of, and this is one that I like a lot. So if you look at the grayscale, if you look at the color of this object here and here, this one looks like a dark surface, and this one looks like a bright surface, right? All of you agree? Okay, so now look at what happens when I obscure this corner. Is this looking dark and is this looking light? So the difference has gone away. They're exactly the same level of gray. Okay, so what's going on? When I turn it back, I've just shown you that the same image is actually the gray level here and the gray level here is exactly the same. Okay, but still, when I put this corner back to you, again, you should be seeing a dark surface on top and the white surface at the bottom. So what's going on? Why is your brain actually trying to fool you? Well, I would argue that the brain is not trying to fool you, because the job of your visual system is not to measure brightness in the image. Your job of your visual system is to figure out what is actually out there in the world. So if you look at what is out here in the world, you'll see that this part of the visual image is actually lit by a light falling on from above, okay, and it's not in the shadow, whereas this part is actually in the shadow. So if something in the shadow is actually as bright as something that is not in the shadow in the light, then the thing that's in the light must be actually darker, right? That's the inference that your visual system is actually doing to produce this kind of illusion, okay? That's why, and this part of the image is actually a crucial part of that illusion, because it's giving you a clue about the lighting direction of the image, okay? So what I want to really impress upon you is that your visual system is faced constantly with this problem of inference, because the content of the image is not strong enough to tell you what is actually out there, and your visual system has to constantly figure out what is actually out there, okay? So that's illusion number one. The second one, I hope all of you have seen this. Please raise your hand if you have not seen this. Okay, good, but you should have seen this by now. If you've been, you'd have seen this image, and I want to run this quick poll because I'm a vision scientist, and it's an experiment waiting to be done. So how many of you see this as white and gold? Okay, not a pretty big fraction. So all of you are my friends. Who of you who sees it as blue and black? Okay, so this illusion varies depending on the lighting conditions, okay? So, but the interesting thing about the illusion, and this is why it broke the internet, is that when you look at this illusion, when you see it as white and gold, you cannot believe that somebody can see it as blue and black, okay? The people who see it as blue and black will not believe that somebody else can see it as white and gold, okay? So what's going on? I mean, what's going on with our brain? What's the problem, okay? So here's an explanation that, here's one explanation, still an active area of research. If you have a question, please raise your hand, I'll be happy to answer it. But here's one explanation that vision scientists think that is actually responsible for what's going on. The idea here is that whenever you look at any image, you have to figure out the true color of an object. Now, how do you figure out the true color of an object? Well, you have to factor out the lighting color that is falling on the object itself. So for example, in a reddish kind of room like this, this is all reddish light. So the real color of the object might be obscured by the fact that light falling on it is a different color altogether, okay? So the idea here that what's happening here is that this image is somewhat ambiguous. So, and the ambiguous image actually reveals your beliefs about the color of light that might fall on the object. So here's an interesting explanation from XKCD, very interesting comic, by the way. So here's the color of the dress. Now, inside your mind, if you have some implicit belief that light falling on an object is generally bluish in color, then blue light falling on a white and gold dress will actually produce this image, okay? If you have some internal belief that light that falls on objects is generally yellowish in color, then yellow light falling on a blue and black dress will actually produce this image. So what your brain seems to be doing is to try and factor out the, or try and deduce the true color of the object while factoring out the light that's falling on the object itself. Okay, so if you saw it as blue and black, presumably your implicit belief is that light that's falling on, light that you've seen in your experience, or maybe it's genetically determined, whatever it is, you have some implicit belief that light that is falling is generally yellowish. Okay, and that's why you are able to see it as blue and black. Okay. Another example. Here's an image that we actually took a photograph of this in our lab, outside our lab rather. This is Pramod. He's not a midget. He's a real sized person, but he looks like a midget here. Okay, and even though I have this knowledge that Pramod is not a midget, I look at this and my visual system says, you know what? I don't care what you think about Pramod. He's a midget here. Okay, so what's going on here? Here's another view of this same display. We've just photographed the same scene from a different point of view. And this is really the main setup that we've shown here. Okay? So what we've done here is that the base of the chair is actually twice as big, but it's twice the distance from the camera. So that when you look at the right point of view, the chair is actually the base of the chair looks like it's sitting on the top of the base of the seat of the chair sitting on the top of the legs. Okay? So then what's the brain trying to do here? Okay? So the interesting thing here is that the brain is basically saying, or rather the interesting thing here is the brain doesn't know the true size of an object. Okay? Why is it that you don't know the true size of an object? Well, the reason is if something is closer to you, it produces a bigger image. So you fundamentally don't know how big an object is, because it could be just closer or it could be actually a bigger thing but is further away. So how does your brain figure it out? Well, it's going to try and do all this calculation and inference to figure out how big an object is. And this is a case where the inference has gone bad because we've given it a very clever coincidence of cues. So what have we done here? We've said that at this point of view, the chair is looking like a plausible object. And if the chair is looking like a plausible object, then this object is actually right next to Saurabh, who's standing here. Okay, if the chair is actually a plausible object at this location, then the brain has figured out that this is the depth of at this depth, the Pramod is producing a small image. Okay, so if a small object if I have a small image on my retina, but the object is close by, it must be a small object. Okay, if it's a large image on my retina and the object is close by, then it's a large object. So you have to always figure out where the actual depth of the object is. So this is what your brain is doing here, and that's how it produces the inference that Pramod is a midget. Okay? This is even more extreme in this particular demo. And this really highlights the fact that your brain really doesn't know how big things are. Okay? Okay, so all of this is happening because your brain is trying to figure out exactly how far away something is and then how big something is. Okay? And all of these illusions, of course, are constructed very carefully by vision scientists to reveal these hidden assumptions that your brain is actually engaging in. Okay? It doesn't happen all the time because most of the time all these cues are in agreement with each other, and so it's very obvious how big something is. But sometimes if you carefully construct these illusions, you can reveal what your brain is trying to do. Okay? So it may get kind of downhill and less interesting from here, but what I want to do in the time that I have left, how much time do I have left? Maybe, okay. Okay. So what I want to do now is to give you a sort of sample of the kind of things that we are doing in our lab. This is our lab at ISC Vision Lab, and you can read about it. We have some sort of infrequent Facebook presence, and but these are all the things that we do in our lab. That is, we are trying to understand how vision works in humans. That's our broad general goal. I'm going to show you examples of how we use visual perception in humans to understand vision. We also do brain imaging in humans. So we take people to an MRI scanner. We can image the activity in different parts of the brain where they're looking at stuff. And very interesting patterns. We can compare the visual processing in different regions of the brain. We also record from neurons in the monkey visual cortex. And a uniting theme of all of this is that we're using computational models. So we actually use computer vision, compare with computer vision quite a lot, go back and forth and so on. Okay? So the question that I want to really put to you today, which we've been studying for a while, is to understand, we want to understand how objects can be, we want to see whether objects can be understood using their parts. Okay? So here's an example. We all see objects around us every day. We perceive the objects to be containing various distinct parts, and we simply wanted to understand, can we understand the percept of a whole object? And it's a very fundamental, sort of almost philosophical question. Can we understand the whole using the sum of the parts? And how do the parts combine to form the whole? Okay, so that's a sort of uniting theme that we've been pursuing across many, many different studies in the lab. And this is the not midget Pramod, who's actually doing the who's been doing some of these studies with me. So we started out with objects like this. The reason we started with objects like these is that we wanted to keep the two parts of an object very separate from each other. We thought that if you put the parts abutting each other, then you would create all these new junctions and features that potentially the perceptual system could be using. So we wanted to keep two parts of an object far away from each other. So that started out. We've of course done further experiments where we've joined them together and seen what happens. But this is a set that we started out with. And the idea here is that I can create a large number of objects using a very small number of parts. This is crucial because then we can see how the small number of parts might combine to create the whole object. Okay? So then we wanted to know, for example, we notice things of this sort. If you look at this pair of objects, these two objects look very similar to each other, whereas this pair of objects doesn't look so similar to each other. But logically, they're both equally similar because they differ in one part. They share one part and they're different in one part. So how do you go about actually looking at how the visual system compares objects or considers which object is similar to which? So to answer this kind of question, we've been using a principle that's actually found in nature. And again, I'll have a little visual experiment for all of you. Raise your hand if you find a leopard in the image. Okay? Might be a bit hard to find, but all of you guys are pretty good. This is the principle of camouflage. Of course, now there's no leopard to be found. But the key idea here is that actually the object is hard to find because it's similar to its surroundings. That's really the key principle here, which is that if you want to know, okay, so here's the leopard in case you haven't found it. It's very difficult to find because the markings on the leopard actually have evolved such that it's similar to its surroundings. Okay? And come and talk to me at the break or afterwards about, there's lots of interesting things to say about camouflage, including answers to several mysteries like why do many animals have white fur on their bellies? This is a reason having to do with visual perception. And this also interestingly tells us that all animals share many aspects of visual perception because leopards haven't really evolved to be hidden to human beings, they've evolved to be hidden to their prey. Okay? So, but what we've done in our lab, and this is a principle that everyone who studies vision often uses, is to abstract out this basic idea that if you take a long time to find an object, then it's very similar to its surroundings. So for example, in this display, the odd one out, there's only one odd one out, and there's identical items, and here the odd one out is a little bit easy to find. And that means that these two objects are very dissimilar to each other. That's the basic idea. But on the other hand, here the odd one out is a little bit harder to find, and that's because these two objects are similar to each other. Okay? So all of you must have experienced this as you looked at this display. So then the interesting thing is if I do many, many such experiments, I can construct a map of your perception, which is that I can tell you in your perception how similar you think these objects might be. So for example, this is a map that we've created. The idea behind this map is that two objects that are close by on this map are actually hard to find in visual search. This is exactly the one, a pair of objects is an experiment that we've done. Okay? So you can see many interesting patterns like all these objects that share the crescent actually are, how are we doing on time? Okay. So all the objects that share a part actually are close together, which means that if you have one of these objects against the other, then it's a hard search. You also see mirror images, that is that mirror images are actually close to each other. That's a well-known idea of mirror confusion. And the basic idea that we wanted to see in this experiment is to see whether we can explain all of this data using the fact that there's only a small number of parts that have created these objects. Okay? So this is the basic model that we've created to explain the data. The idea is that we have two objects, AB and CD. They're created from parts AB and parts CD. And we are just listing out all possible interactions between these parts. So for example, we thought that maybe the visual system compares the corresponding parts of these two objects. Maybe it also compares the parts at opposite locations in these two objects. And for completeness, we also thought that the visual system might care about the similarities of the parts within each object. That's the full model. And it turns out that this is a very solvable model. We can solve it using standard regression. And it produces a very good fit to the data. What I'm showing here is the observed data versus the predicted data. And the basic idea here is that the dissimilarity between objects can be explained using dissimilarities between the parts. Okay? And maybe I should kind of wrap up here. So I'll just summarize what we've been doing after that. So what do you do when you find a rule? Okay? So that's what I'm putting up here. What do you do when you find a rule that says that the dissimilarity between objects is explained using the dissimilarities between the parts? Well, you try to break it, of course, right? So we've been trying to break that rule now. So when you start breaking the rule, the most obvious thing we could think of to break the rule is to look at objects like these, which do not look like they contain parts. Okay? So you look at these objects and you feel like, okay, these are kind of symmetric objects. The two parts are actually, there's no boundary between the two parts. There's no separation between the two parts. So can we explain how these objects look in perception? And more interestingly, there's a long history in visual perception and actually even in art of the fact that symmetry is a very special property. So for example, we've been creating architecture of this kind. This is the Somnathpur temple in Karnataka. And we all appreciate symmetry in art. We appreciate symmetry in people's faces. We appreciate symmetry actually everywhere. So the question is symmetry something special in the sense that the brain realizes that the two parts of an object are identical and creates something that is more than the sum of the parts? Okay? And now we can actually answer this question because we can say whether symmetric objects are different from the sum of the parts or not. And to cut a slightly longer story short, we found that symmetric objects actually are the sum of the parts. So there's nothing special that's going on when the brain looks at a symmetric object. It is still behaving as the sum of the parts, but still that property of this kind of part summation explains how we perceive symmetry. So I think I'll kind of just wrap up there, skipping a bunch of things, but just to tell you that okay, so the brain uses a sophisticated code for objects. I hope I've made you think a little bit about vision. It operates according to simple linear rules. We found a couple of interesting rules. Trying to break that rule seems to lead to some insight, and that's kind of what we've been trying to do, establish how things interact, and then try to see whether whether special conditions are there where they don't interact or they shouldn't be interacting in that way, and try to see if those are deviations. And then, of course, understanding this nature of this kind of sophisticated code might help us make computers see more like us. So thank you for your attention. I'll take questions. Yeah. Yes.
So why can't we make the computer see?
Yeah.
What do you think?
So basically what I think is going on is that the visual system is doing, so in computers when you try to represent an image, you try to preserve all the detail that is present in the image. Whereas if you look at the way the visual system works in our brain, it's actually not trying to preserve all the details. It's actually trying to throw away certain details in the image so as to make feature processing and object recognition more efficient. And we haven't quite discovered what the format of that representation should be. So if we do figure it out, maybe a computer vision person might figure out what's a good way to represent the image. Maybe a vision scientist or a person who studies, a neuroscientist might figure it out, but I think that's up for grabs. That is that we don't really know what is, the format of the code in which the brain is using to represent objects.
And you also talked about the symmetry.
That's right.
So symmetry is quite prevalent in nature.
Yeah.
So what do you think? What might be the reason?
So what we have found is actually that symmetric objects tend to stand out. Compared to asymmetric objects, symmetric objects actually tend to become a little bit more distinctive in perception, and that's a measurable effect. And that's really what we think is why symmetry is becoming more special. And what we've actually shown is that the time you take to detect symmetry in an object can be related to how much it stands out compared to its surroundings. And that we think explains how very, very regular objects like circles and so on are considered highly symmetric because they have many self-similar pieces in them. And that's why I think, at least that's our provisional explanation for why it's that case.
So my question is, according to you, if computers are not so much perfect in doing things, even after so much advancement in computer technology, can we expect in future that computers will dominate over humans in future and will replace humans at the place of work? Can we rely on computers?
So I think we are very, very far from such a future, although there are lots of people who have imagined such a future, but we're nowhere close to any of that. What is crucial here is, I mean, in the early days of AI, there were a lot of people who thought very deeply about how computers might change the way, or how they may emulate human thinking. And we don't understand how many of these things happen in the brain. And for instance, the early thought was all of the question of artificial intelligence boils down to this question. This is a quote by Douglas Hofstadter, who said, what is the letter A? That is, how do we understand when something, if you look at a distorted version of the letter A, how do you recognize it as the original letter? Well, we're very far from the future where computers might dominate. But they are already dominating us in terms of calculations and various kinds of numerical processes already. So it's not like they're not dominating in certain other fields.
Okay, thank you.
In the interest of time, we'll take one last question, sorry, and we will let one of the young generation take it.
So you just said, what is the letter A? What is the letter A? So how do we perceive different handwritings? Yeah. Like in A, I have written something and you have written something. How do I perceive that they are the same thing?
So it appears that the brain's able to generalize across distortions of some particular shape. And when you look at these captchas, those distorted letters on websites, you don't see the same distortion ever again. And you might not have seen that particular distorted letter ever before also. But the reason that you're able to recognize the letter A is because perhaps you're looking at some diagnostic sort of features in that letter. We don't know what those features are. And so we can't really say what is it that actually, but there's apparently a family of distortions that we can handle even in faces. Like you can take a face and actually even just open it up in some image program and squish it heavily. You'll still be able to recognize your friend, and you'll be able to do quite a bit of recognition even though they're very distorted. So the family of those distortions that we can handle is not known. Okay.
All right, thank you so much,
great.
Arun, for that fantastic and very, very interesting talk.